All right. Hi, everybody. Uh, my name is Nir Isakovich. I'm the director of the Applied Ethics Center at UMass in Boston, and you are very welcome to our second annual workshop on living with artificial intelligence or on AI and experience, our AIX project, which has been an ongoing research project at UMass Boston for the last few years. This workshop is themed around AI and prediction. It was supposed to take place in person in the spring, but was postponed due to COVID. Uh, we decided to have it on Zoom and to break it up into 3 hour-and-a-half segments. There were originally 7 participants that were um, supposed to be with us, or seven participants in the workshop. So we have broken that up into today's meeting, and there are 2 more meetings, one on November 10th and one on December 1st. So please look out for messages about those and join us for those as well. The format is going to be more or less the same for all of these, 30 minutes for each presenter, and then Q&A period for about another 30 minutes, plus minus. Will formally end at the hour-and-a-half mark, but we can keep talking a little bit more if people have interest and time. I will give first prerogative for question for our other participants, for the 5 other participants in the workshop, so that we can maintain at least some of the structure of the initial idea. So today's speakers are Dan Feldman and Kevin. I'll briefly introduce them both, and then I will turn it over to them. Dan is the Senior Research Fellow at the Applied Ethics Center. He's a software engineering executive and advisor to startups. He has many, many years of experience developing leading edge computing systems in a wide variety of industries, including financial, healthcare, and wearable computers. He has served as the senior engineering executive in several startups, including 2 MIT Media Lab spinouts and an early e-health company that received the Computer World Smithsonian Innovation Award. He's served in leadership roles at IBM, Thomson Financial Services, and Hewlett Packard Enterprises. He's currently CTO at TouchPlan.io, and before that, he was VP of Operations at Kayak and Director of System Software Research at Hewlett Packard Labs. And Dan has a bachelor's in social science from Harvard. Dan's paper is titled "Recommendation Algorithms: The End of Serendipity?" And Kevin is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Ethics Institute at Northeastern here in Boston, where he works in data ethics. He's especially interested in the ways technology enables those who own and produce it to exploit those who use it. In connection with this, he has done research on privacy, online tracking, and data analysis, and now on dark patterns and the ethics of user interfaces. And Kevin's paper is titled "Manipulation Without Intentions: Dark Patterns and the Ethics of User Interfaces." So Dan and Kevin and everybody else, welcome. And Dan, I will let you take it away. If I could ask the rest of us to mute ourselves for the duration of the presentations. Dan, please.
Well, I'm being told near that the host has disabled participant screen sharing.
The host has, wow. Well, the host has not done that, but let me check that very quickly. One participant can share at a time. Hold on. Can you try again?
Mm-hmm. Ah, much better.
There we go.
All right.
I just opened the menu and did nothing, by the way.
Okay, so I got the name of my talk wrong. Oh, well, essentially the same idea. So what are the implications of recommender systems for serendipity, or at least how are they related to each other? And so I want to start with, as I often do with these things, some kind of brief allusion to the actual underlying technology. So I think the important things here are that, what recommender systems are trying to do is to make a prediction about our preferences. And there are a couple different ways they can do it. One is to look at what we've already demonstrated a preference for, and try to figure out from that things that are like it. So that involves clustering the content, the stuff that you could select from. And the other approach is to ask what others who are like us, however that's determined, have preferred, which I characterize here as clustering the user. That's also referred to as collaborative filtering, by the way. Although I think that's a somewhat odd use of the term collaborative, but that's where it fits. And I chose this particular graphic because by and large, but not exclusively, we run into recommender systems in some commercial context. And this is a graphic that was designed to introduce these technologies specifically to people who are, marketers who are not going to get particularly sophisticated about their understanding, but need to know the basics. And they're, kind of nicely ambiguous here. Use clustering algorithms on the customer base, which could mean clustering the content that the customers like versus clustering the customers themselves. Okay, so, and then serendipity. So serendipity is this, once upon a time neologism from Horace Walpole. It's based on this Persian story that's set in Sri Lanka of three princes who get sent out by their father, who's taken good care to make sure they were well educated. It sends them off to experience the world, and they have a variety of adventures, and always triumph through some combination of sort of being in the right place at the right time and deductive reasoning. There's something kind of Sherlock Holmesian about some of their experiences. Deducing that this track was made by a camel carrying a pregnant woman who was lame on one side, kind of thing. And he wrote to Horace Mann about this and referred to this as serendipity and defined it as making discoveries by accident and sagacity of things which they were not in quest of. And I'm going to call this strong serendipity, try to distinguish it from the weak in a second. If you look at modern dictionaries, they take a different approach, sort of. They say, that essentially it's a happy accident or a fortuitous discovery. That is to say, they drop this requirement for sagacity. And I think this compares pretty favorably with Louis Pasteur's observation that in science, chance favors the prepared mind. So prepared, but not necessarily reasoning, right? Ready to see that something as it occurs, but not necessarily deducing it directly. So I'm going to call this weak serendipity. I don't know that there's any particularly good reason to choose those terms, by the way. I think I was thinking of the strong and weak programs in SDSS and things like that. Okay, so where does serendipity fit? I think there are a number of related concepts, and I wanted to explore sort of how it fits in with those. And in order to do that, I tried to develop this taxonomy. It seems that chance is a component of serendipity, things that are unsought. Intention seems to have a role to play. You're out in the world doing things, maybe even engaged in some particular kind of a search. And sagacity, according to Walpole, is a critical component. And so if we look at fate has none of those things. If it's fated, it's not random or chance. If it's fated, you as the object of fate rather than the subject of some kind of activity can't express any intent around it. And what the soundness of your judgment or the breadth of your knowledge have nothing to do with the outcome. Luck's the same, except now you get chance, right? I don't think you can assert intent or sagacity in a purely lucky situation. And then going back to the prior slide, weak serendipity adds intention and strong serendipity adds sagacity. Then my next step is to ask some questions about circumstances under which we see these kinds of phenomena in action, and how would they fit into this taxonomy. So widely cited as an example of serendipity is Fleming's discovery of penicillin. He was doing experiments with things that he thought were antibacterial. He sneezed in a sample plate. He went away on vacation. He came back. A bread mold spore had landed there, and it had failed to thrive because the penicillin mold had prevented the propagation of the bacteria. Yeah, there's some chance here, right? He didn't know that the penicillin was going to land on the plate. He was certainly intending to run an experiment, and the sagacity that people assert here is that instead of saying, "Oh, this was a contaminated sample," and throwing it away, he recognized that even though it wasn't in the set of substances he was searching for, he was using as search components of his search for an antibacterial. He had found one. Another example, which I sort of resonates more with me, is you're in a library or a bookstore and you're browsing through the stacks, and you come across something that you didn't really expect to find, but you say, "Gee, this is great," for whatever reason. And I think you could argue that meets the criteria as established in this taxonomy for being a serendipitous discovery. There was some intent to randomize the experience, right? You were seeking something, but not anything in particular. And there was some amount of your own intellectual capacity brought to recognizing that you had found something that was interesting and appropriate. I think there's something similar going on when you're reading the literature and you go chase down a citation, and you say, that's just the thing I need for this other thing I'm working on. Except I would argue that there's just not a ton of chance involved in that. I mean, you're clearly in the literature in a related area looking for something. There's the blind date situation. Again, there's a fair amount of chance you've asked somebody, presumably, to make a recommendation for you. You should go out to dinner with this person, but you don't know who it is. You're certainly throwing the dice to some degree, and there's no judgment on your part involved in selecting who that partner is. There may be plenty in deciding whether to go forward, but not in the initial situation. And I would argue that there's something similar going on with movie recommendations. They're essentially blind dates. If you get them from somebody you trust, whether that's the Roger Ebert website or a friend, you're basically saying, "I don't know what you're going to suggest, but please suggest something." And I think that once you get to recommendations from a website that you aren't looking for, you get to something very different. Because at this point, you're not choosing, in some sense, to excuse me, to get the recommendation. It's being presented to you, and you haven't sort of enrolled chance in this in any particular way yourself, and your judgment has nothing to do with what's getting presented. This is the raw power of the pattern matching engine trying to decide whether or not to present you with an option. And I think if you go back to here, the interesting thing about the recommender system example is that it matches in the taxonomy with fate. Now, there's this phenomenon of allowing something else to make a decision for you, and accepting it as it is. Another potential example is driving directions from Google, say, which are always, and this we mostly know, but they're always biased towards the shortest route. So unless you do something, you're going to be taken on the shortest route, and you've ceded any kind of judgment about how you're going to get from A to B to this rather opaque machine, but not entirely opaque. So maybe it's not as apt an example. But it's not the same as, you know, opening up an atlas and saying, gee, I like those small roads. That's the scenic route. I'll take that and I'll have a blast figuring out what I find along the way. And by the way, that example was the one that sort of got me wanting to go down this path at all in the first place. Sort of the question of, well, if we stop having these not explicitly sought, certainly, experiences, what have we lost? So that brings me to this question of what's the sort of the status of automatic recommendations. And I would argue that at best, they're similar to this concept of weak serendipity, in that they don't, for the most part, require any particular knowledge or judgment on our part to get them. They don't come from anything that involves our judgment. And that the automatic recommendations that we get all the time, unsolicited, are most close to fate in terms of the way they interact with our future. And that there seems to be no role really for strong serendipity. And even if we could sort of say, well, I've chosen which recommender engine I'm going to work with, that doesn't get us much closer. Only at the best, it gets us to this idea of weak serendipity, of a happy accident. And that's, just as to counter that, that's not true of all automated information search and discovery by any means. So there are plenty of tools out there that support automated literature search. There are a ton of them in the medical world, but the sort of the premier ones, the National Library of Medicine's toolkit. And by choosing them, you're actually, I think, using your own knowledge and judgment to tilt the playing field towards something that's more likely to get you a useful result. And in that sense is closer to strong than weak serendipity. And then I'd like to suggest that the implications here are that passive consumption of unsought recommendations is really asking to be manipulated. It's ceding control to the enterprise that implements the recommender system. And to the extent that we do that routinely, we're complicit in our own disempowerment around a wide variety of choices. Certainly in almost any retail commercial setting on the web, anything you could be shopping for. And you can look at those on the web shopping things as information discovery processes. I think you should. And I think that the things that you lose in these environments are intention and sagacity, or at least the opportunity to exercise those. And then maybe foreshadowing some of Kevin's argument, if I'm inferring enough of the right stuff from the title, although these businesses that are producing these recommendations want us to believe that we have a relationship with their brand, we are in fact only objects to them, and any of the intersubjectivity that would have historically been associated with asking for advice has been completely removed and isn't actually replaced by anything genuinely empathic. So far less than 30 minutes, Nir.
That is perfectly okay, and will leave us a little more time for Q&A, which is also great. Uh, Kevin, are you able to share your screen?
Let's find out.
Yes.
Excellent.
Okay.
Okay. So that's actually a really nice segue into my presentation. So thanks for that, Dan. Okay. So artificial intelligence is kind of gradually taking over a variety of decisions for us, taking over, supplementing. We can decide how strongly we want to word this. But kind of the basic point is that we're offloading decisions that would traditionally have been made by an autonomous individual to some kind of machine learning algorithm or an artificial intelligence. There's lots of examples of this. So what route should I take to the store? What music should I listen to? What products should I buy? Often algorithms are playing kind of increasing roles in our decision processes in these domains. And this raises certain subtle questions about autonomy and kind of potential threats this raises there too. So kind of what does it do to my autonomy and what does it do to serendipity, as Dan mentioned, when I let algorithms kind of not quite infiltrate, but play a significant role in my decision procedures in these domains. And I think these questions are really important. I think they're really interesting. I'm actually going to set them mostly aside, and I'm going to kind of look at a more nefarious case. And I'm interested in this, kind of what about more egregious threats to our autonomy from artificial intelligence or these algorithms? And there are kind of two questions that got me thinking about this. Number one, what if artificial intelligences are actively designed to manipulate us, as basically many of them clearly are? Or number two, and this is actually what I'm going to focus on today, what if artificial intelligence manipulates us without ever being designed to do so? And I want to focus on this for a couple of reasons. Number one, because I think it's actually becoming extremely likely that as we deploy more and more sophisticated algorithms and artificial intelligences, they're likely to be able to engage in manipulation without being designed to do so. And I owe you an argument for that, but I expect that this is coming, and to some extent, it's already here. Number two is that this question actually raises interesting questions about the nature and theory of manipulation. So specifically, I guess I'll jump back to this in a minute, but there are kind of a variety of accounts of manipulation on offer today, according to which it would actually be conceptually impossible for an artificial intelligence to manipulate us without being designed. So there's kind of a payoff for what I'm thinking about is that this can hopefully shed some light on theories of manipulation. Okay, example number one, what if artificial intelligence is designed to manipulate us or otherwise employed in our manipulation? There's lots of examples of how this is happening. Targeted advertising is probably the best one, but to give you something more visceral, we can look at recent little scandal involving Facebook. So I'll just read this quote. A recent case that captured much public attention offers a hint at how these practices are evolving, these practices being kind of online manipulation, targeted advertising. In May 2017, an Australian newspaper reported that it had obtained a leaked internal Facebook strategy document describing how advertisers could use the company's platform to target advertisements at teenagers as young as 14 years old at moments when they feel vulnerable. By monitoring posts, pictures, interactions, and internet activity in real time, Facebook can work out when young people feel stressed, defeated, overwhelmed, anxious, nervous, stupid, silly, useless, and a failure, the report claims. And my reaction to this is one of discomfort. I imagine that's probably a lot of your reactions as well, because obviously Facebook is not your friend. Facebook is interested in promoting its own economic interests. It's interested in targeting you with advertisements and establishing relations with advertisers. And just kind of the knowledge that they can discern these kind of emotional states and potentially employ them in this manipulation apparatus is disconcerting. And in the interest of fairness, I should flag that Facebook says that this is not currently how they use this system. But kind of a natural thing to worry about is, okay, but it looks like they could. So this is one example where we might worry that AI can be designed to manipulate us. But again, this is not my central focus today, although hopefully what I cover is going to shed some light on this. I'm interested in this question here. What if artificial intelligence manipulates us without being intentionally designed to do so? I just want to flag again, according to many contemporary understandings of manipulation, this is conceptually impossible. So I've got some examples here. These are four particularly famous accounts of manipulation in the philosophy literature. So I start with number one from Nagel. This brings out what seems to be crucial to making an action manipulative, that it is done with a certain kind of insincere, conniving intention. And artificial intelligence of the sort of science fiction maybe could have insincere, conniving intentions. Maybe sometime down the road we'll be dealing with such artificial intelligences. But I hope it's, at least on the surface of things, it looks like a kind of machine learning algorithm or the more simple artificial intelligences we're dealing with today, arguably they can't connive, arguably they lack that kind of intention. You can get kind of an even stronger claim if you look at Marsha Barron's APA address on manipulativeness. And I'll just flag, she actually focuses on manipulativeness as a character trait rather than an action type. But kind of that's all the more grist for my mill insofar as you might think that, again, artificial intelligences can't at the moment have character traits. But she says this: manipulativeness generally reflects either a failure to view others as rational beings or an impatience over the nuisance of having to treat them as rational and as equals. Among equals, and in the interest of having a community of equals, manipulation should for the most part be avoided, and manipulativeness clearly proclaimed a vice. I really like this account of manipulation. It's not quite as detailed as I would like, but I think it gets something deeply right about manipulation as a relation between persons. And the idea is that there's something about manipulation, and I owe you much more details on what manipulation is, but there's something about manipulation that shows a lack of respect for your rational equals. That's a problem. There's a problem in the attitude we're adopting to other people as we try and influence their behavior. Once again, it's not obvious to me that artificial intelligences in their current form can adopt this kind of complex attitude. Number 3, this is from Daniel Susser, B.D. Rosler, and Helen Nissenbaum. The notion of manipulation naturally evokes the image of a manipulator, and influences hidden by natural or accidental means would not likely undermine a person's sense of self-authorship. It is known and expected that some of the underlying causes of experience lay outside conscious awareness. In retrospect, that quote does not speak for itself, but kind of the proposal here, and we'll get into this, is that they think manipulation involves hidden influence, and it's kind of essential to the view that hidden influence involves someone intentionally hiding something. They have some kind of ulterior motive, or they're using strategies that you can't quite become aware of. And once again, this notion of hiding something seems to presuppose someone who's actually doing the hiding. So if you look at many of our contemporary theories of manipulation, it looks like AI manipulation is conceptually impossible. It can be used for manipulative purposes, but it couldn't manipulate by itself. However, I do want to flag, there's one view that I could find in the literature that would make this possible. This is Alan Wood's view of manipulation. We'll get into this in more detail, but he just explicitly says, I've argued that coercion does not require a coercer. People can be coerced by circumstances for which no assignable person or persons is or are responsible. It might be wondered whether such a thing can happen with manipulation as well. I think it can. So we'll kind of look later at how his account handles this case, but there is some dissent here. That said, kind of the majority view right now is that manipulations are determined, at least in part, by the intentions of the manipulator, and kind of we make the plausible assumptions that artificial intelligences lack these complicated intentions. They can't manipulate us all by themselves. Okay, so what? So why are we worried about this? As mentioned, I think that we are going to start seeing AIs that are going to engage in manipulation and that will largely be able to do this by themselves. So one thing I want to do in this talk is kind of give you some examples of what got me thinking about this and why I think this is something we should take seriously. And then my hope is that, again, by thinking this through, we learn something about artificial intelligence and we learn something about manipulation. So let me distinguish two theses. I'm actually not sure which one I endorse, but I'm going to try and defend the bold thesis. So the bold thesis says this: artificial intelligences can manipulate us, and we need an account of manipulation that helps us understand this. So this is kind of what I have my eye on, but I'll mention that a more modest thesis is just this: artificial intelligences can do things that raise many of the same moral questions as manipulation does, and we can draw on accounts of manipulation to help us understand this. So there's a more modest thesis, but I'm gonna shoot for gold, and I'm gonna try and defend the bold thesis. Okay, I've talked a lot about manipulation. I situated it a little bit. What I want to do in this section is do two things. First, I've got some examples of current strategies online right now that are being used to manipulate people. And then second, I want to bridge these strategies and show how kind of similar stuff could easily be done by artificial intelligences. So that's the aims of this section. So first, just to situate this a little bit more, what is manipulation? Manipulation has to do with a way of influencing a rational being's behavior. So if I want to influence your behavior, there's a variety of strategies I can employ. So I can incentivize you. I can give you a reward. I can pay you. I'll give you $50 if you do this. That can influence your behavior. I can threaten you. I can say, for example, if you don't do this, I'm going to do something terrible. This is typically not a very good idea, but in principle, it's out there. A kind of more common, the gold standard for how we think we should interact with other rational adults is I can try and convince you, or I can ask you to do something. I can just try and make a case, give you reasons why doing something is a good idea, either for you or for other people, etc. Then there's this like kind of broad, sometimes nebulous class of other strategies we can employ that we group together under manipulation. And again, it's contentious what exactly manipulation is. I don't want to define it just yet, but kind of here are some examples. I can guilt you, so I can appeal to your emotions in bad ways. And I want to emphasize that guilt might not always be manipulative. Sometimes you should feel guilty, and making you feel guilty in ways that you should feel guilty is probably not manipulative. But I could also guilt trip you in unreasonable ways. I could try and elicit guilty emotions that are unjustified and unwarranted, and that does start to look manipulative. I can outright lie to you. We'll talk a little more about why this counts as manipulation, but on most accounts, lying is a way of manipulating you. I kind of feed you faulty information to disrupt your ability to make your own decisions. I can pressure you. I can kind of disrupt your ability to think clearly by like really getting in your face or trying to make you make a decision in a time-sensitive manner. These are the kind of things I have in mind when I talk about manipulation. Okay, let's get some cases. As mentioned, these are things that are actually going on online today. They're kind of fun in a perverse way. So these are examples of what computer scientists and user interface designers are calling dark patterns. And just kind of as a first pass definition, dark patterns are a variety of strategies that interface designers employ to kind of manipulate users to perform actions that go against their ends, but that benefit the business in question. I got lots of examples, again, kind of fun, but also actually deeply perverse. But hopefully everyone kind of sees the trick here. So this is the consent to a tracking agreement. They're asking if they can use cookies. And they've got these little checkboxes, which kind of suggest to you that if you leave these unchecked, then if you click the big blue button, then you're not going to get any cookies. But in fact, if you click the big blue button, select all and continue, you've got this little select all part, and you're going to get all the tracking. You get all the cookies. And one thing that I think makes this particularly nefarious is to notice that these checkboxes, at least at first blush, appear to do nothing at all. So if you click no thanks, presumably, assuming no thanks means what it does, and you actually can't always take that for granted, but if you click no thanks, presumably you're opting out of cookies. And if you click select all and continue, then you're opting into cookies. And it looks to me like kind of the function of this interface is just to convince people that kind of you just really quickly, because you don't really look at these, you don't really read these, you just click the big blue button because you want to get to your website, convince them that that's not opting into cookies and not opting into tracking when it actually is. So it's one example of manipulation online. This one's a little bit more contentious, but I think it's rather fun. I don't know if you've ever used Duolingo. I think they've subsequently toned this down slightly, but you start using Duolingo and you stop, and they will try and get you to use their services again. I love the little note at the bottom. Learn Italian today or he will eat a poison loaf of bread. The next email will be a funeral evite. It's kind of rather significant attempts to play on your emotions. This is a fun one. So you're signing up for a mobile phone, I believe, and there's this button, and this button says keeping in touch. And they say, by pressing continue, you are giving us and other Virgin companies permission to inform you of future products and services. And here's the punchline. We will keep in touch by post, phone, and email. Sorry, here's the punchline. Don't want us to stay in touch. Tick the box, and we won't contact you or share your information with other Virgin companies for marketing purposes. So the trick here is that, again, people don't read these particularly carefully. You see a button, it's called keeping in touch, and you say, no, I don't want you to keep in touch. I get enough spam, thanks very much. So you leave that unchecked, and now you're going to get spammed. You have legally opted into their marketing apparatus because, kind of against all common sense, to get them to leave you alone, you have to check the keeping in touch box. You guys probably get the point, so maybe I'll stop. This one's just hilarious. Do not uncheck this box if you wish to be contacted via email about product updates, upgrades, special offers, and pricing. That is a mess to unpack. I will leave you to unpack it on your own time, but just it's intentional obfuscation. They're just trying to make the decision difficult so the people who move quickly will make mistakes. There's lots more of these, but probably this gives you a sufficient taste for kind of what the worry is here. Here are some formal definitions. I don't think we need them, so I'll just kind of move on. So kind of here's my thought on this. So thought number one, many of these dark patterns look manipulative, at least if they were intentionally designed to influence people. And in these examples, they almost certainly were. It's kind of not an accident that that box says do not uncheck. It's not an accident that they've got this really cute bird who's crying and telling you to use the services. This is designed to influence people, and it's effective. It's effective at influencing people. And kind of we might disagree about cases. Maybe not all of these you think rise to the level of manipulation, but something that's going on here looks manipulative. And at least in the clear case that these were designed by interface designers who wanted to manipulate us. And kind of my proposal is that if we look at some of these cases, this looks like this is manipulative regardless of the intentions behind it, at least in an important sense. It looks like there's a problem here. There's a problem with the form of influence that this is going to exert on us. And yes, one way to understand this is to look at the agent who's designing it, say, hey, you're not showing proper respect for your rational equals or something like that. Kind of even if that explanation fails, there's still something wrong here just because of what this does to users. So this is kind of part one. I want to push the intuition that this looks manipulative regardless of the intentions behind it. But kind of what I want to do now is make the connection to artificial intelligence and how that is going to work in this context. And kind of the thing that we need to think about is why these are effective. So why do these work? And take it on faith that these do work. There's kind of a lot of robust data collection that goes on in the interface design industry, and they don't deploy these just for fun. They deploy these because they are successful at accomplishing what they want to accomplish. So why are these effective? Sometimes they involve outright deception. Sometimes they just lie to you, and it's kind of obvious why lying to people can manipulate them, because if I, again, misunderstand what I'm doing, that's going to get me to do what you want me to do and not what I want to do. Others probably involve something much subtler. They involve what's in the psychology literature known as nudges. Probably this is familiar to most people at this point, so I'll cover it quickly, but I want to just give you the background. So nudges are interventions that steer people in particular directions, but that also allow them to go their own way. This is from Taylor and Sunstein, who kind of introduced the concept. To qualify as a nudge, an intervention must not impose significant material incentives. A subsidy is not a nudge. A tax is not a nudge. A fine or a jail sentence is not a nudge. If an intervention imposes significant material costs on choosers, it might of course be justified, but it's not a nudge. So the idea is that there's ways of structuring our choice architecture, by which they mean the context in which we make decisions, that kind of have reliable impacts on how we make our decisions. There's different ways of kind of subtly tweaking the context in which we make some choice that reliably drive us in certain directions and not others. And this has been kind of robustly demonstrated in a lot of different domains. An example here that is particularly well known is there's a cafeteria example, where what they learned is that whatever food they put at eye level is more likely to be consumed by other foods. And kind of one thing that I believe Taylor and Sunstein actually endorse is they say you should put your healthy food at eye level. So put your salads at eye level, and by all means sell junk food, and by all means sell red meat, but put it somewhere else. And what the evidence suggests is that this actually has a significant impact on whether people eat healthy food. Kind of something as simple as just what's at eye level and what isn't. But there's lots more examples of this. So there's the framing effect, where kind of information that is framed in different ways, despite being logically equivalent, has very different motivational impacts. So for example, if you say something a procedure has a 90% survival rate, people really like that. They like 90% survival. If you say something that a procedure has a 10% death rate, people don't like that. They don't like things framed in terms of death, even though it's exactly the same mathematically. So just a quick example of this, Lyft actually was looking for how they could motivate drivers to try and stay on the road. And they had two different models. And one model said, if you stay on the road, you can make this much money. If you stop driving now, you're going to miss out on this much money. And what they found is that there's a significant difference in those ways of presenting the information. Tell people they're going to miss out on money, they're way more motivated to stick around and keep driving. Tell them that they can gain money, not as effective. Again, in the interest of fairness to Lyft, I should mention they say they didn't deploy this strategy, but kind of they noticed that it worked. There's a lot of robust evidence that this stuff works. Okay, we can talk about this more in the Q&A if people want details. I'm kind of assuming that a lot of us have encountered this before, so I'm going to give you guys the punchline. And kind of the punchline is how it ties in with artificial intelligence. And the thing to notice is that very often when people are designing interfaces, how they design interfaces is in a data-driven way. So currently they engage in A/B testing. This involves various degrees of AI assistance, but the basic idea is you deploy different versions of your website or your app or your interface to different people, and you define a success metric. So I look for example, who clicks on my ads, or who signs up for my newsletter, or who buys my product. You have a success metric, then you deploy lots of different interfaces to lots of different people, and you pick whichever one succeeds by your success metric. So whichever one gets more clicks on your ads or whatever is the interface that you ultimately deploy. And there's lots of examples of this being done. Companies are performing all kinds of A/B tests all the time, typically on users in a live way. So they'll just divide people into groups, and you will see one version of Google and someone else will see another. And sometimes what they test for is extremely subtle and yet extremely effective. So a classic example here, and this is admittedly uncharacteristic, this was very successful. There's a famous example from Bing, where Bing ran a set of experiments on font colors. And to kind of just take a close look at these and notice the subtle differences, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about a difference between different shades of blue and different shades of green and different shades of black or gray. And they, through A/B testing, deployed these interfaces to different users, and they discovered that actually some colors are significantly better than others. And just by tweaking their colors, they were able to improve their revenue by $10 million annually. And that kind of defies belief. So they vetted this. They did additional experiments to replicate this, and once again, they found the same results. These like extremely subtle changes of colors have robust impacts on how people are using the services. Okay, so we're finally ready to see the artificial intelligence link, which is this. When you start engaging in this kind of data-driven interface design, or this data-driven process where you're trying to influence people to perform certain actions, given what we know about human psychology, so I'll give you guys this slide first. Given what we know about human psychology, and given that we know that people are kind of susceptible to a variety of biases and there are a variety of ways of nudging. I'm sorry, my headset turned off, but we're back. Given what we know about human psychology and that we're susceptible to all of these forms of influence, if you just do a data-driven approach to try and generate your interface, you just follow whatever gives you success, you are very likely going to find strategies that are going to be exploiting these kind of biases. And kind of the connection to artificial intelligence is that it seems to me like an artificial intelligence could to do this basically by itself. And the crucial question here is that it has to have some access to a manipulative strategy. It has to be able to generate them. But kind of if it just randomly deploys elements in different ways and it just kind of subtly moves them around and changes colors and changes wording, maybe by employing synonyms, just by randomly following success, you can end up with something that looks manipulative. You can end up with something that is going to kind of be exploiting these biases, or they're going to nudge us in a variety of ways, and it can have significant impacts on our decision making. So I kind of encapsulate this like this. If you train an artificial intelligence based on some success metric, and if the artificial intelligence has access to manipulative strategies in its arsenal or can randomly generate them, your artificial intelligence may end up deploying manipulative strategies because manipulation works. There's lots of evidence that manipulation works. I focused on interface design because this is something that's actually happening out there in the wild. Another example that I could have focused on would be targeted ads, where you just deploy ads. Kind of you use all the information you get and you deploy the ads in as many contexts as you can, and you just chase success. And what you might end up doing is deploying ads to people who feel vulnerable and to people who feel in a variety of emotional states, just like Facebook was finding, because that might be an effective way to get them to click on your ads and buy your products. So kind of the linchpin of how this ties in with artificial intelligence is just that follow the data and let an AI do that. You can end up with strategies that look manipulative. And again, it looks to me like some of these strategies, the crying bird, certain uses of word, kind of are manipulative regardless of the intentions behind it. Okay, that's the setup. This is the concern. This is what I'm thinking about. What I want to do now is kind of take a closer look at manipulation and kind of understand how our accounts of manipulation either can or cannot accommodate this kind of phenomenon. So one thing that's important to recognize is that when you look at accounts of manipulation, we'll see some in a minute, they almost always understand manipulation as involving two components. So one component is that there are certain intentions on behalf of the manipulator. The manipulator means to be doing something. And that's, for most accounts, an essential part of what it is to be manipulative. But then a second part is kind of, it's not enough, for at least for successful manipulation, just to have certain intentions. There have to be certain effects that are brought about in the person you are trying to manipulate. And kind of the presence of effects, so number two, differentiates successful from unsuccessful manipulation. But the presence of intentions, number one, is kind of what makes things manipulative in the first place. Kind of is a very standard way of understanding it. And obviously, if we want to apply this to artificial intelligences, we kind of have a bit of a hurdle because the worry comes with number one, certain intentions on behalf of the manipulator. So we need to argue or show one of two things. One, we need to show that we can understand manipulation just in terms of the effects on the manipulated. That'd be one way to go. If we could get a robust account of manipulation that just looks at the effects on people. Or number two, we need to show that artificial intelligences can have something analogous to the relevant intentions. If we could pull either of those tricks off, we're going to be able to apply our accounts of manipulation to manipulative artifacts. I think we can probably do both. I will flag that I am considerably less certain about strategy B. So I'll just flag that that's more of a work in progress. I think strategy A almost indisputably succeeds. Let's take a look at why. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at three views of manipulation. I'm going to look at the non-rational influence view, best represented by Alan Wood 2014, the trickery view from Robert Noggle, kind of a very influential paper on manipulation, and the more recent hidden influence view. And I want to flag that each of these views has strengths and weaknesses. They handle some cases better than others. They all kind of make a plausible claim to understand manipulation. I'm not going to try and adjudicate between these theories. I'm not going to try and dispute them. I'm just going to try and see what happens when we apply these theories to the kind of manipulative artifacts that I have in mind. And by an artifact, I just mean something like an artificial intelligence, which was designed by human beings in some sense, but that doesn't have the kind of relevant intentions that we think of as being present in a full-blown mind. Okay, strategy one. We're going to try and understand manipulation just in terms of the effects on the person who is manipulated. And there's actually one view that lends itself very nicely to this. This is the non-rational influence view of manipulation. This is a dense slide, so we're going to unpack it. But the basic idea is this. We can understand manipulation in terms of kind of the processes it targets in our decision making. And the idea is that when we make decisions, sometimes the processes we undergo in making these decisions are rational processes. And I'll flag, I'm not going to unpack this. I'm not going to unpack what makes a process rational. The view owes us an account of that, but I can't give you one here. But the idea is that sometimes we make decisions in rational ways, and sometimes we make decisions in irrational ways or non-rational ways. And manipulation is kind of intentional forms of influence that try and target our non-rational decision-making procedures. And I think kind of the best way to see this is to kind of imagine the failure cases, and in the literature, two have been teased out in particular. So one possibility is that our rational capacities are bypassed. So kind of something influences us and it gets us to make a decision in a way that we don't really reflect on or don't suitably integrate with our values and beliefs and desires, such that we just kind of end up doing something without really thinking it through. And in that respect, our capacities were bypassed. Kind of a classic example here, and this is false, it doesn't work this way, but in the literature, people were really worried about subliminal messaging. They're worried about kind of these like hidden messages in advertising taking over our psychology and just causing us to do things. And regrettably, I think that this kind of shaped the philosophical imagination on this topic. And kind of when people talk about bypassing, I think they have in mind this kind of process that's not very realistic. But kind of a better example would be just a really strong fear response. If I can get you to be afraid, your fear can cloud your judgment and can get you to do things without really thinking about it. So there's an example of how we might just get you to do something without thinking about it in a way that kind of classically looks manipulative. Like lots of demagogues love to stoke fear in their audience to try and manipulate them. So that's bypass. Another way you can do it is you can try and subvert rational capacities. And kind of the idea behind subversion is you're still engaging the relevant capacities. You're engaging capacities for thought and reflection or whatever kind of the good case for decision making is. But you engage them in ways that make them extremely likely to fail. So a classic example here is deception. I feed you faulty information to try and get you to do something. And you can no longer use your rational capacities properly because kind of the input into these capacities is faulty and you can't make good decisions because I've fed you faulty information. That's case number one. Case number two, you just employ some of the cognitive biases that we know about. So we know that it's irrational to care about whether something is worded as a 90% survival rate or a 10% death rate. But nonetheless, that is a fairly reliable way of influencing people's decisions. So you can employ that kind of thing. And like on the surface of things, it looks like there's still rational reflection going on. So we're not bypassing it. The doctor says you have a 90% chance of surviving. And I think about that and I say 90%, that's pretty good. But really what's going on here, at least on some level, is that you've kind of intentionally fed me things or information in a way that's likely to disrupt my capacity to think properly. And kind of the many biases that have been discovered in social psychology are examples of how you could subvert rational capacities. So kind of the proposal here on the non-rational influence view is that manipulation either bypasses or subverts our rational capacities in these ways. And kind of this gives us a straightforward way of understanding artificial intelligence as manipulating us even without intentions. And here's the account. An artifact is manipulative insofar as it tends to influence the behavior of those who use or interact with it in ways that either bypass or subvert their rational decision-making capacities. Extremely straightforward account. So why would we worry about this kind of artifact? Kind of what's the problem insofar as something does this? Standardly, the way to cash this out is just as a threat to autonomy. We think it's important that people make decisions for themselves. We think they have a right to make decisions for themselves. This is the capacity for self-government. And kind of insofar as you disrupt their ability to do this, you're disrupting their autonomy and disrupting their self-government. So it's kind of a straightforward way in which this kind of form of influence maybe is a problem. Okay, that was the easy case. The non-rational influence view developed by Alan Wood is actually designed to be able to handle certain cases in which manipulation takes place without intentions. The next two are much harder, but I think thinking them through has a number of payoffs. So a view of manipulation that's extremely influential is the view from Robert Nagel. He calls it the trickery view. I think it's better to understand this as the faulty attitude view, but kind of the label is not super important. So I will let the man himself speak. So he says this. The term manipulation suggests that the victim is treated as though she were some sort of object or machine. It's as though the manipulator controls his victim by adjusting her psychological levers. There are three main levers the manipulator can operate. They are belief, desire, and emotion. This suggests that there are three main ways of manipulating someone. That is, three distinct ways the manipulator can lead his victim astray. The paths from which the victim can be led astray are paths towards certain ideals. These are the ideals to which we strive to get our beliefs, desires, and emotions to conform. It is the striving that the manipulator attempts to thwart. To put the point a bit less metaphorically, there are certain norms or ideals that govern beliefs, desires, and emotions. I am suggesting that manipulative action is the attempt to get someone's beliefs, desires, or emotions to violate these norms and to fall short of these ideals. So kind of the core idea here is that we can look at certain attitudes, and he focuses on beliefs, desires, and emotions. And we can recognize that there are something like ideals or standards that these attitudes ought to strive for or kind of ought to be in conformity with. And you manipulate someone when you intentionally try and get these attitudes to fall short of these ideals. And this is actually surprisingly, maybe not surprising, maybe this is obvious to you guys. I found it surprising that this is actually really good at accounting for lots of cases of manipulations. So deception immediately fits. I give you false information that's going to fall short of the ideal for belief, which is truth. Let's go with emotions. I can instill fear. And if I instill fear in a context in which fear is not warranted, that kind of falls short of the emotional ideals, which is that you have emotions in ways that are apt and fitting to the object of these emotions. So fear kind of fits that very nicely. Desires, he says, the ideal for a desire is that you desire something that's actually good for you. And you can kind of tweak people's desires by getting them to desire things that they really shouldn't want. You can do this with advertising very frequently and get people to desire things that are bad for them or maybe not best for them. And once again, that's falling standard for the ideal for desires because you should desire things that are good for you. So like a powerful, a nice account that covers a lot of cases of manipulation. This one is actually somewhat harder, at least as the view is stated, to make sense of manipulative artifacts for the following reason. There's this question, how do we understand these ideals? And Nagel's answer to this question is, well, we should understand them by reference to the manipulator's own beliefs. So for example, what makes it the case that fear is or is not warranted when it comes to, oh, I don't know, coronavirus? There's something fun. Is fear or is fear not warranted there? And kind of one of Nagel's proposals is that that's a very difficult question. And in fact, it's not always clear that there's going to be unique answers here. And so kind of to understand whether something is manipulative, we shouldn't try and find the objective answer of whether fear is warranted here. We can just look at the manipulator. We can say, look, does the manipulator believe that fear is warranted in this circumstance? And if the manipulator is intentionally inducing an attitude that they regard as faulty, then that looks like manipulation. But by contrast, if the I'll now call them an influencer, if the influencer is intentionally inducing an attitude that they believe is warranted, they're trying to make us afraid of coronavirus because they think we should be afraid of coronavirus, then we might think that they're making a mistake, but it doesn't look like it's manipulative. So I'm not convinced that you can modify this view in a way that is going to stay true to what we mean when we use the word manipulation. However, I think you can still get some lessons here. So notice that there's two alternatives to this strategy. So he relativizes them to the manipulator's ideals. But you could, number one, just use objective standards, and you would get the following account. An artifact is manipulative insofar as it tends to cause the attitudes of those who interact with it to fall short of these objective standards. There are difficulties for this view. You need a meta-ethical commitment to objective ideals. That's popular, so maybe not the end of the world. It requires us to know what these ideals are to assess whether some artifact is manipulative. In concrete cases, that might be more tricky. But at least sometimes we can probably come up with clear cases. Sometimes you just objectively should or should not be afraid of something. Something can or cannot be a cause for concern. So I think objective standards is not the end of the world. A different way you could go is you could relativize the ideals to the manipulated's understanding of them. So you focus on the person who is being manipulated and you look at the ideals that they hold for their attitudes. And you get an account like this. An artifact is manipulative insofar as it tends to cause the attitudes of those who interact with it to fall short of what they take the ideals for their attitudes to be. There are problems with this. It just basically admits of counterexamples for what we think of manipulation as actually being. A kind of a particularly clear example here is some people might have entrenched prejudices, and I might try and dislodge your prejudices. So you might be really racist, and you might think that kind of the appropriate emotional response to someone from a race you're prejudiced against is prejudice or fear or anger. I might try and dislodge that. I might employ strategies to dislodge that. Depending on the strategy, it's not clear that that would be manipulative. But kind of by definition, insofar as I'm dislodging you from the ideals that you hold for these attitudes, it ends up being manipulative if we make this move. So I think there's no clear way to kind of adopt the trickery view, which is otherwise a very nice view of manipulation, to artificial intelligences. If anyone has ideas in the Q&A, I'd love to hear them. I can't see kind of a straightforward way to pull this off. I will flag, however, that if we kind of set aside concerns about the way we use the word manipulation, what applying this view to manipulative artifacts potentially does is just give us things to worry about, regardless of whether it counts as manipulation. So if we understand it in terms of objective standards, then what manipulative artifacts might do is just lead us astray from good ideals. And that's a problem. We should recognize that kind of as we offload our decisions to artificial intelligences, they can do this. Another possibility, if you relativize them to the manipulated's understanding of their values, then artifacts might influence our attitudes so as to lead us away from ideals that are authentically ours. Again, I'm not super clear that this is going to actually pan out. Linguistic intuitions probably would not call all of this manipulation, but kind of we've put our finger on a problem here normatively, and I think that's already a decent payoff. So kind of I summarize this here. If we just apply the non-rational influence view and we apply the trickery view, we get this. Artifacts, kind of regardless of the intentions behind them, might subvert our capacity for self-government. They might lead us astray. They might lead us to hold certain attitudes that are not authentically ours. That kind of interesting. That's something we should think about in connection with these artifacts that exert influence on our decision-making processes. Okay, I have 3 minutes. I've already gone over time. I'm going to try and do this super quickly. I think there might be a way of understanding artificial intelligences as having intentions. And this is cagey, so I could use help with this, but I think there's plausible moves that can be made here. So the first move you could make, I guess I'll skip well, I guess I need this. One move you could make is you could go full Dennett. So you could understand intentions in terms of an intentional stance, or if anyone's not familiar with that, just in kind of a radically deflationary way. You could deflate what it is to be an intention, and then you deflate it enough, suddenly artificial intelligences start looking like they have intentions. That's one move you can make. I don't love it. It's contentious. I think we can do better, but I'll just flag that's a strategy. But let's suss this out by looking at the hidden influence view. Unfortunately, I don't have time to cover this in detail, but kind of the hidden influence view, the idea is that I manipulate you when I kind of hide my motives or hide intentionally how something is influencing your decision making. So for example, if I go out of my way to say, hey, this surgery has a 90% survival rate because I know that that's going to bias your decision making in certain ways, and I kind of just pass it off as, hey, I'm just presenting this information to you, but really there's this kind of hidden motive and this influence is itself operating in this hidden way, that can count as manipulative. That's kind of the idea. And kind of a difficulty for this view, at least as we apply to manipulative artifacts, is that something being hidden seems to require someone to do the hiding. Otherwise, hidden just means not transparent. But you can't just say you're being manipulated because your decision-making procedures are not transparent, because that's actually the norm. It's extremely common that we have only kind of sometimes more, sometimes less, but definitely incomplete transparency in our decision-making. So an example, I would try and justify a moral judgment, and we're kind of really confident that this judgment is right, but it takes a lot of work to figure out why it's right. So you don't want to just do it in terms of transparency. And kind of my fundamental proposal here, and I'll conclude with this thought, is that the kind of AIs that I'm worried about and the kind of AIs that are likely to operate in this domain are AIs that are going to have been trained up on a success metric. There's going to be kind of in a, people hate this word, but I could use it anyway. There's like something teleological going on here. We're training the AI toward a goal state. The goal state is, for example, getting more clicks or selling more products or et cetera. And because of this, there's a sense in which the strategies that the AI deploys are being done for the sake of a goal. And we can look at the connection between the strategies are deployed and the goal that it was trained for. And I think we might be able to generate something that looks like an intention enough that we can do the work here. So I've got an analogy at the bottom here. Imagine I employ a thought experiment to get you to accept some philosophical theory, and it's not fully transparent how the thought experiment works, but it's kind of reliable. And you're like, yeah, I see that. I see why you like this theory. By itself, that doesn't look manipulative. But instead, imagine I employ a thought experiment that I kind of know is tricky. I know that you're going to have this reaction, and I know that if you thought it through, you wouldn't have this reaction. And I kind of rely on the fact that the thought experiment is non-transparent as a way of influencing you. Well, that starts to look manipulative. And kind of my proposal is, based on the ways that AIs are going to be trained in this domain, we might be able to do something similar. So you can contrast kind of an AI that is employing certain non-transparent influences in a way that's been intentionally, like, that's the key to its success. And if an AI is deploying these strategies because that's the way to influence behavior, that might be sufficient to ground the intentions such that we could actually make sense of hidden influence. If you're presenting information to me in a way precisely because this is non-transparent in a way that kind of precludes me from thinking about it rationally and making decisions, and that's the key to your success, we might be able to distinguish a kind of meaningful sense of hidden influence that is enough to kind of drive intentions and understand AIs in this intention way. I'll flag at the bottom, I think this point generalizes. I made it with respect to hidden influence, but you could do the same thing, for example, for intentionally exploiting our emotions, but it is 12:01, so I will end the talk there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Dan. And we will open this up for questions. So let's start with our participant. Jay, I see you have a question.
question. I'll try to make it a short observation and challenge. The problem I have with the account is twofold. One is ahistoricity, and the other is the assumption of a perfect chooser. The ahistoricity is, I think we could all probably agree that every society, the powerful groups exercise disproportionate control over information and aesthetic choice. And that yet within every society, individuals are struggling to define aesthetic choice and to choose information. They turn to curators, editors, other sources for their choices. Sometimes those choices are motivated by subcultural concerns or desire for individuation or whatever. But there is no pure observer or chooser that could be found. And I give the example of, if you like a book and you go to the library, you like Jane Austen, you go to the library and you see what else is on the Jane Austen shelf. Well, the Dewey Decimal System is an information architecture that shapes your choice. And it may have been shaped itself by capitalism and patriarchy and all kinds of things. And the fact that what you see next to Jane Austen on the shelf is other romance literature instead of the Communist Manifesto and Proudhon was a choice. Or it could have been, you know, comedies of errors or something, whatever might be on that shelf. Those are shaping your aesthetic and informational choices. That's just a given. The question is whether artificial intelligence is giving us new tools to proceed in ways which are counter-hegemonic. And I think if you could never find yourself following queer Chinese dramas or lectures by Noam Chomsky on YouTube, then yes, that would be a clear example of the unfortunate hegemonic shape.
The best timing.
So yeah, sorry about that. The CIA, you know. So anyway, I think there's the problem. The counterfactual is artificial intelligence allowing us to have tools today which allow us freer choices? It's informing us more accurately about the choices of people like us who could be counter-hegemonic in various ways. And is it also allowing us to explore whether there is an authentic self in ways that, if I like X, what other things might people like me do? And then eventually you find yourself in a corner of one. And I think that that's far more compelling to me as a liberatory potential of this technology, despite it existing. Sorry about that. I'm done.
Okay.
Maybe I'll take a stab at responding. Yes, there's a lot of points here that I agree with and that I hope my thesis is not in tension with. So I'll try and accept these, and then we'll see if I can suss out a position, because I do think there's a challenge here. But I'll start with this. Kind of one worry here is that maybe kind of the account of manipulation I'm developing presupposes that there's such a thing as not being influenced in these ways or not being manipulated. Maybe there's this unrealistic conception of kind of the ideal chooser or the pure chooser, but that's a fiction. Decision never works that way. Yeah, so that's an absolutely fair point. Robert Noggle addresses this in a later paper, so I'll just say what he says and we'll see what we think of it. But he says, just because our decision-making is always influenced in a variety of ways doesn't mean that you're allowed to kind of gum up the works in further ways. So we recognize that kind of the ideal chooser is a fiction, but we still recognize that there are certain strategies we can employ that kind of make us even worse off. And he gives us this metaphor, and he's like, imagine you're on a boat at sea and there are kind of waves that are tossing you in every direction and it's so difficult for you to go straight. Like, yes, there's a respect in which that makes it hard to navigate, but that doesn't mean I'm allowed to come along and push you and push you off course even more. So kind of my proposal there is that I want to recognize this, and there are subtle questions raised by exactly what counts as manipulative, given the respects that we are always kind of bombarded by these influences. But it seems like at least sometimes we can make sense of the idea that these manipulations really are kind of either steering us off course or kind of proceeding in illicit ways. And I take it that, I guess one way of saying this is that we need a theory of manipulation that can come to terms with this and that can make sense of manipulation, because this is a real phenomenon, despite the ways in which our choosing is always conditioned in these ways. And I think these accounts can do it. I don't see why they can't, even though I want to recognize that kind of there are concerns here, and I didn't mean to ignore them. So that was challenge number one I heard. Challenge number two, and I love this, kind of what I take you to be saying is, don't ignore the benefits. There are benefits to having the AIs engage in this kind of procedure, and this might actually be kind of counter-hegemonic. It might actually help us make decisions in a variety of ways. That's a great point. So I definitely don't mean to say anything that's in tension with that. I still can't shake the feeling that there's a lot of potential for harm here. Like Facebook knowing when teenagers are vulnerable, that's scary. Facebook knowing when I'm vulnerable, that's scary, and thinking what they could do with it. There's room for harm here, even though we want to be careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and recognize that actually there's lots of good uses of this technology too.
Jesse?
Yeah, thanks. These were really interesting talks that I think hang together very well. My question is for Dan. So I sort of take as a given that the kind of the pleasure of serendipity, right? I think that like it just pulls it at sort of our, it intuitively resonates with me. I think one interesting thing is to think of, times when reducing serendipity is really desirable, right? So like one of the reasons I love to go and visit Manhattan, or at least I used to, was that you can sort of, the zoning is kind of quirky, so you can walk along the street and you'll have all types of, right? There are just all these moments, right?
Yeah.
Serendipity. But if I really want to find something specific and my wife whips out Yelp, I don't say to her, you're really reducing the serendipity here. I think more that, this is very helpful. And so I could, I can see the sort of reduction in happy accidents. So I guess like it's sort of a balance. So how do I put the question? Yeah. In your thought, how do you, within these systems, how do you kind of balance the sort of brute utility of it and how it's very helpful versus the kind of serendipity of potentially being a little quirky. And I'll give just one example of like sort of what I find really delightful is when when Amazon's like algorithm, you can see where it's broken and it recommends something that is just totally bonkers compared to, as a replacement for like mozzarella cheese, it has rubber gloves. And it's just, that's a happy accident that I really enjoy. But anyway, so back to the.
But you get no utility out of it if you're looking for cheese.
Yeah. Well, exactly.
So one of the things that has shown up in some of the literature is the idea that, specifically around information search, and most of what I was able to find in the literature around serendipity is around information search in particular, and online automated information search. And one of the things that shows up is the idea of deliberately randomizing the result at the margin, right? So most of the time we're going to give you these things that fit our model of who you are and what you'll like, but we'll throw in something else. We'll throw in this, the rubber gloves, because who knows, it might take you somewhere you'll like. I mean, I guess in my account, that would at best be weak serendipity. And yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that, all experience should be serendipitous, right? There's clearly lots of times when you really just want to get to the answer, or, to the store as quickly as possible. I'm right now commuting, essentially. I got out of the city. I'm out in Lenox. There are times when I would really like to know what's happening on the Mass Pike and have Google tell me the fastest route. Yeah, so I don't see them as in any kind of tension. That, the observation that the tools we have for information discovery might be inhibiting our access to serendipity in certain circumstances doesn't mean that we shouldn't have those tools. I think it's just something to be aware of.
Sure. Can I ask just one kind of follow-up question, which is, so there are some, right? So I have a friend who does like an online dating.
Yeah.
He says that the real kind of downside is there's no serendipity. You sort of just know, right? You're getting, if you want vanilla ice cream, it's going to be vanilla ice cream. Every ice cream is going to pop up. It's going to be vanilla.
Yeah.
but those, so lots of kind of tech and software is incentivized to be designed to sort of deliver that. So it's sort of problematic, and right, there is a tension there, I guess, in sort of the design of how to think about what might be serendipitous moments within being delivered, and would that count, right? Are those happy accidents if they're actually sort of engineered to be,
Yeah, well, this is why I would argue those are a lot more like fate. They have nothing to do with either weak or strong serendipity. Right? Somebody has designed the outcome for you.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, so, can I and talk to Kevin for a sec? Nir, it's okay?
Please do.
Yeah, absolutely. Just I'll just say that after you talk to Kevin, we'll hear from Bill and then from Jason.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
So your anxiety around AI and manipulation strikes me as an echo of an older conversation in the science technology studies literature around artifacts and politics. And this kind of underlying question of do artifacts intrinsically have political positions or play a political role? Have you engaged with that stuff at all?
I have not, and I would love to hear more.
Okay, well, that can go on for a while, and there are others who want to ask questions, but probably the place to start is Langdon Winter's article, Do Artifacts Have Politics?
I'll check it out. Thank you.
Excellent. That is a good recommendation. Bill, good morning, sir, or good afternoon by now.
How are you doing? Hey, thanks for a great set of presentations, Dan and Kevin. Those were fantastic. I had a question for Kevin and then one for Dan. So for Kevin, I wonder, really great presentation and nice kind of lay of the land for the issues here. I wonder if the term artificial intelligence is underspecified a bit, just because I think a lot of your questions are about whether or not we have things like corporate agency or corporate responsibility. And I think you might be able to get a lot of answers to some of your questions if you attached artifacts and tools to the entities that created them. Because as far as I know, there really aren't any free-ranging AIs, right? I mean, they all were built by someone, usually for a purpose, as Dan said, mostly to sell things. So it seems like that might get you all the beliefs, desires, and attitudes you need from some theory of corporateness that can give you attributions of responsibility. But I'd just be interested in your thoughts there. And then the other question, I'll just throw it out, and then is for Dan, but really for you both. And I wonder if some of these questions might be resolved if we have a better theory of context. So what I mean by that is that, as Dan mentioned, a lot of the activity that takes place on the internet is about selling things. And so I sometimes worry that what we're kind of doing collectively as philosophers is tantamount to going to the mall, walking into Sears and jacking up the salesman, right? And saying, you manipulator. And what we really need is a sociology of sales, where we say, no, we all understand that when we're in marketplaces, buying and selling happens, and that there needs to be some caveat emptor style relationships, that it is the the buyer's responsibility to do some due diligence as well, just like you do when you go into Sears. And that might help you nibble away at the extreme cases where it suddenly sounds like we're condemning, all nudging attempts that take place in marketplaces. So anyhow, just kind of two quick observations and reactions from either of you would be great. Thank you. Great talks.
Thank you. Dan, you want to go first, or shall I? Okay. So kind of one question you raised for me was, I'll phrase it like this. I'm searching for intentions. Why not just find the intentions in the entities who are responsible for the artificial intelligences? Why not just find them in Google? And that's kind of I agree. That's definitely a way to go. The reason I didn't was just because I thought this was kind of an interesting way of raising questions about manipulation. It just struck me that there could be non-intentional or things that look not very intentional processes that could result in something that looks like manipulation. So I wanted to use this to kind of try and shed light on these issues. But kind of insofar as we're worried more about social problems, I think you're right. The simpler strategy is just to attach the attentions to the entities who deploy them. So that's a fair point. Number two, about context invariance. Yeah, it's a great point. I I kind of have two minds about this. This is coming up in some of my other research, but Google shows me targeted ads, and Google has sophisticated training algorithms that make these ads likely to be effective. Like, how much is this a problem? And to what extent can I just accept, like, look, I'm using Google services. Maybe they're allowed to manipulate me in this way. So on the one hand, I want to recognize that, I don't know, there are benefits to this system. I get access to all kinds of services for free because I let Google do this to me. And I have a hard time believing that I am all that manipulated by this, although I suspect that probably we overestimate our resilience. That'd be my guess. But I feel like I'm not that susceptible to it. So I'm kind of sympathetic to an idea that imposes some kind of caveat emptor. And kind of all I can say is I think caveat emptor is only going to go so far. And I think there are going to be some strategies that are going to look pretty suspicious, like trying to find specific vulnerabilities. An example, are you familiar with the target pregnancy example?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So like, when you start employing strategies like that, just like hyper targeting people at moments when they're particularly vulnerable, I think things look suspicious. But you're right that there are lots of subtle questions about where exactly we draw this line. And I probably don't want to, although some people do, I probably don't want to say no manipulation is ever okay. So caveat emptor will take us somewhere. I guess I need to think more about how far. So thanks for bringing it up.
Yeah, the thing that struck me in that conversation was, well, sort of to both questions. One was that, you know, there is a world of advertising and influence long before there was deep neural networks. So what's new here, right? You know, we've been dealing with it with things like truth in advertising laws and some attempts to get clear about what is and isn't fraudulent, right? So there have been some efforts outside of this sort of the deployment of technology. But I think that there is a legitimate underlying point that that the technology is a very efficient way to do these things, and maybe the line has to move as you get to scale and sufficiency and precision, right? So the precise targeting is one of the things that's really novel. You know, when you were limited to, you know, three television networks, and, you know, was it Frito-Lay or Ruffles who was going to get in your face the most effectively? It's different from, you know, 500 different brands can find you and micro target you. Is that a service? There was a time 20 years ago when I would have argued, because I had some technology I was trying to sell, when I would have argued that that, you know, it's actually a service to the consumer to make sure they don't see a bunch of trash they're not interested in. You know, echoing Kevin's comment there. But I thought the other thing that was kind of interesting in Kevin's setup was the idea of, you know, well, is there a way in which these these software systems become genuinely autonomous and goal-seeking on their own? And the tie-in to the idea of evolving a strategy. Actually, there's a bunch of technical work called genetic programming that's built entirely out of that approach, is to say, well, we'll just find a fitness function and we'll keep mutating the code until we achieve the fitness function. And they're surprisingly effective. They're not mainstream, but they're surprisingly effective. So I think, you know, it's not to be dismissed as a worry. And I think when you start considering we had a talk in the speaker series about the law and independent entities, IIs as independent legal actors, and, you know, you start putting all of these pieces together, and there's a plausible way to argue that if the goal is I want to be independent and make money, you know, by accumulating a numeric value in this thing called a bank account with cryptocurrency, these things could be completely autonomous once they get set off running. So I think it's a legitimate concern.
Those are great points. Thanks.
Jason.
Yes, great. I want to echo something that's been said before, and I think it would be very useful to try and think of intentionality within artifacts themselves, especially pulling in some material semiotics. And in particular, it seems like they ought to adopt the intentionality of designers putting in specific affordances. That kind of seems like an obvious possible one. But for a simpler matter, why don't you just adopt objective functions as AI intentionality?
Could you say slightly more about what you mean?
So if you have any sort of optimization system which changes behavior and has a specifically stated objective function, why not consider like the behavior under that objective function to be the intentionality of the system.
Yeah, great. So I think that's what I was trying to do in the last couple of minutes is roughly that strategy. And that sounds exactly right, or at least like a plausible way of trying to get intentionality in the system. So kind of I haven't thought through all the details, but it seems promising.
That one seems like an obvious analog. I was also curious for notions of manipulation. They have both these notions of influence, circumventing certain sorts of cognition. They often have this notion of being towards some end, whether it be the intention of the actor, but they seem to need some sort of systemic objective. Otherwise, just the fact that I'm saying something without purpose towards how it's influencing you seems non-manipulative. But also, I want to question whether it's value aligned and asking why manipulation or the definitions of manipulation need to be inherently negative, and what you would call things that look exactly like manipulation but are value aligned with the user.
Yeah, good. The manipulation literature itself is actually divided on this. So some people think that manipulation by definition is bad or wrong, kind of either all things considered or at least prima facie. Some people think you can use it neutrally. So I'll flag, we talked about the non-rational influence view, which involved engaging certain processes. Kind of Alan Wood's defense of that view is kind of explicit that he does not take manipulation to always be bad. He thinks sometimes you can manipulate people for good ends. So that's definitely possible. When is manipulation going to be for good ends? So I kind of like Nagel's view here. So we're focusing on attitudes and we're focusing on ideals, and maybe not for all strategies is this okay, but insofar as I'm trying to influence you, maybe even with nudging, if I'm trying to influence you to bring your attitudes closer to correct ideals, that seems like it might be a good thing. So for the obvious example, Sunstein wants to put healthy food at eye level because that predictably influences the food that we buy. That seems great. I don't mean to suggest that there's necessarily any problem there. I feel like I haven't fully satisfactorily addressed that, except to say these are great lines of thought that I need to pursue.
Could I suggest two observations, two further observations on manipulation, for lack of a better word, from the phenomenology of manipulating. The first is that being manipulative as a psychopathology, so being manipulative as a pejorative adjective, actually pretty often happens without the complete awareness of the manipulator. So a manipulator will pretty often deny that they're being manipulative, and you would have to kind of probably unpack the form of the behavior before it was brought to the fore of their consciousness. Insofar as something like that is, and of course there's nefarious straight up manipulations, the sort of very intentional manipulations, but quite often manipulative people, right, they don't acknowledge that they're being manipulative, and that's part of what's maddening about them. Insofar as that's the case, maybe the distance for an AI being manipulative without awareness on at least that psychological account of manipulation is somewhat shortened. So that's one comment on sort of manipulation as a psychopathology. And the other comment comes from the other direction of being subject to manipulation. It often, there's a time lapse or a time delay before we realize that we have been manipulated. There's this sort of feeling that something weird happened, but you don't quite know what it is. And it, again, takes you a little time to unpack why you acted in a way that's not completely consistent with your agenda or with your agency or with your prior decision. And again, maybe that buffering moment or time delay is something that could be incorporated into an account of AI manipulation.
Take a stab at this. So one thing I'm worried about in connection with this, I think there's something here, but I'm at least worried about this. I think it's extremely plausible that people can manipulate in a sense unintentionally, or at least in a sense that they can be unaware that they've done it. Insofar as at least I think sometimes we might reflect on our behavior and be like, wow, that was really manipulative of me. And kind of it wasn't aware to us in the moment that we were doing that. But I wonder if what's going on there is a case where we lack intentions. We weren't intending to manipulate, or if kind of maybe it would be better described as us kind of not being aware of what our intentions were. And I think that depending on how we cleave that up, the path to AI manipulation might be very different. So if we can make a case that we actually lack the intentions, that would be really helpful. But if it's the case that we have these kind of robust subconscious intentions that we just weren't aware of, then at least I think it still does close the gap a little bit. But kind of there'd be much more of a story that needs to be told if that's what's going on. And I'm not sure which is the better account.
Got it.
That's really interesting, though. Thank you.
Excellent. I think we have time for one last question if anybody wants to.
Wait, there's a lot of questions in the chat.
Oh, okay. That's right. Let me go back. Let's see. Oh, AZ, please, do you want to unmute and ask your question that's in the chat since you haven't spoken yet?
Hello.
Yeah, hi. Welcome.
I guess I'm not sure if it's a question or more of just a minor point is, what do you think about manipulation as the difference between real and stated purposes of the engine? And it doesn't mean, of course, that there is no overlap in specific cases, but generally speaking, say the YouTube algorithm has the goal of maximizing clicks or revenue or something like that, while as a user, the goal is to find the next best video based on information or value or something like that. And although a lot of the time those might overlap, and in fact, if they did not overlap, the manipulation wouldn't go through, it seems like precisely at the margins where they do not overlap is kind of the room for manipulation.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's kind of a nice way of understanding hidden influence. I think a lot of this will depend on the context in which the algorithm is presented to us. So you might contrast if YouTube says, you will like these videos, then that might be manipulative because they're claiming that what's driving the algorithm is something different. Maybe it's not, because maybe they do think that's true. But by contrast, if the algorithm just says, watch these videos, then maybe this is a domain where caveat emptor implies, and maybe I should recognize that watch these videos makes no pretext to claiming that they're the ideal solution for me. So I'm kind of wondering there if really the way to understand what's going on there is, again, just how the algorithms are presented to the users and whether the presentation of the algorithm absorbs certain forms of deception, because that could certainly be manipulative. And there's kind of a straightforward account of that would just appeal to the intentions of the people deploying it. I have to think through if I can tell this in my without intention story.
Excellent. All right, colleagues and friends, we have reached the end of our allotted time. So thank you very much to Kevin and Dan. That was really great. And thank you all for your questions. And please make sure that you join us for the next two meetings in our series.
Nir, thank you for organizing this.
Thank you. My pleasure. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Hi, everyone.